bond yields. Now let's consider how governments set short-term bond yields in the first place. That is, how they attempt to nudge the economy towards slow, steady growth. One of the main goals of central banks in setting interest rates is to protect the currency from inflation and the economy from the spiraling ill effects of runaway inflation and deflation that we learned about in the currencies module. This is why the central banks for most advanced economies have a 2% inflation target, as we saw earlier. Let's discuss Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Her goal was to eat porridge of just the right temperature, not too hot and not too cold. For central banks, the porridge is the right temperature when inflation is subdued, which provides a stable backdrop for businesses and consumers. The porridge is too hot when inflation is high. This is typically caused by excessive economic growth. The porridge is too cold when there is deflation. This is typically caused by a lack of economic growth. Central banks are petrified of the porridge getting too hot. Once inflation takes hold, it is hard to tame. This is because it is psychological. Once expectations of price increases become ingrained, they are hard to unseat. Let's demonstrate once more this vicious cycle in practice. Imagine if workers expect the prices of consumer goods to rise steeply. They will demand pay increases to offset the higher cost of living. This will cause companies' wages to increase sharply, forcing companies to lift prices in order to maintain their profits. And when the prices of goods go up, workers will expect even more price increases, causing them to demand even more pay increases, which increases company costs even more and forces even more price hikes, and so on. The Cato Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, estimates that there have been 56 bouts of runaway inflation ever recorded. The most extreme forms are driven by war. Think about it. In times of war, governments often print money to finance armies and buy weapons. For example, the major European powers in World War I spent 50% of their GDP to wage war. Due to shortages of basics like food, more money then chased less stuff. This is the essence of inflation. As you can see in this table, major wars involving the United States were accompanied by high inflation. If you thought those numbers were bad, Germany suffered from 24,380% inflation per month shortly after World War I. According to some sources, in November 2008, Zimbabwe suffered from a peak inflation of 89.7 sextillion%. That is 89,700 million percent inflation. This means that prices were multiplying every hour. Every bond investor needs to learn how bond markets are ravaged by inflation. Let's look at inflation measures for a handful of advanced economies: the U.S., France, Canada, and Japan. Inflation was a major problem in the 1970s. The 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement gave governments latitude to alter their currency exchange rates. The previously locked exchange rates had the effect of taming inflation. There were also oil shocks in 1973 and 1979, which caused oil prices to spike. Oil was a major cost in the industrial economy at the time, so these shocks spurred inflation. Accordingly, bonds were a terrible investment from 1945 through to the early 1980s. Paranoid bond investors have watched hawkishly for signs of inflation ever since. Cautious bond investors can type global economy into the command line, select the GEW function, and review the latest inflation figures for dozens of countries in one table. Recall that high inflation will erode the price of bonds and send the yields up. While hyperinflation is spectacular, central banks are equally scared of the porridge getting too cold. As we saw in the currencies module, deflation can also lead to a vicious cycle. Ingrained price declines lead consumers to defer purchases. This causes companies' revenues to decline, which ultimately forces them to lay off workers. As salaries form a large part of GDP, a smaller workforce means less demand, which makes companies cut prices even further in order to keep selling, making workers even more inclined to delay big-ticket purchases, causing companies' revenues to decline even further, prompting further rounds of layoffs, and so on. How do central bankers test the temperature of the porridge to detect an emerging inflation or deflation problem? The main temperature gauges that they use are various inflation readings and the output gap, which is a measure of the slackness or tightness in the economy. Let's start with inflation measures. Central banks review the inflation statistics that we discussed in the economic indicators module. These are the main three that they look at. The GDP deflator from the quarterly GDP report, the less accurate but more frequently reported monthly CPI statistic, and the favorite inflation gauge of the Federal Reserve, core personal consumer expenditure, which strips out the volatile costs of food and energy, such as cereal and oil-based products. But there's a catch. These data sets are historic. They are akin to steering your car by looking in the rearview mirror. As central bankers are trying to anticipate and avoid problems in the future, it would be better if they could see the road ahead. It is far harder to predict inflation rates in the future than it is to observe inflation rates in the past. We already saw one source of inflation expectations in the economic indicators module. Investment bank analysts estimate future CPI for many countries. These estimates are, however, only periodically updated. This makes it hard to determine whether a recent change in inflation is a blip or a trend. Wouldn't it be nice if there were a more real-time source of inflation forecasts? Fortunately, there is. Since 1997, there have been exotic instruments which, in the United States, are called Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, TIPS, for short. Recall that the prices of most fixed-income instruments are corroded by inflation. TIPS are the exception. Instead of having fixed-income payments to the lender, TIPS compensate the lender in the event of inflation, using CPI as a guide. By comparing the price of this bond with the price of a similar non-inflation protected bond, investors can glean inflation expectations. The higher the expected inflation, the greater the investor demand for TIPS relative to normal bonds. Therefore, the greater the difference in yield between the two bonds. If we type inflation break-even rates into the command line, we bring up the ILBE function to glean inflation expectations using the TIPS method. Let's examine long-term inflation expectations over the next 30 years by looking at two countries, Brazil and Italy. Here we can see that at the time the screen was captured, investors expected inflation in Brazil to be 5.89% per year over the following 30 years, while they expected the same number for Italy to be much lower at only 1.36% per year over the following 30 years. While this may sound like a small difference, $1 million would feel like $663,000 in Italy after being eroded by inflation over 30 years. Meanwhile, $1 million in Brazil would feel like just $162,000. Small differences in inflation expectations compound and are highly corrosive to bond prices. No wonder bond investors look hawkishly for signs of inflation. The other main temperature gauge is the output gap, which is the difference between the economy's potential output and its actual output. Tightness in the economy frequently coincides with inflation, while slackness frequently coincides with deflation. Central bankers use this output gap measurement to detect an emerging inflation or deflation problem. The white line shows the potential output of the U.S. economy in billions of dollars. This metric is estimated by a government agency both historically and into the future. This is the amount of goods and services that would be produced if the U.S. were making optimal use of its resources, with neither slackness nor tightness in the economy. The yellow line shows the actual output of the U.S. economy. The output gap is expressed in the form of a ratio. It is the difference between actual output and potential output divided by potential output. When the yellow line is below the white line, there is a negative output gap. The economy has slack and the central bank will be on the lookout for deflation. When the yellow line is above the white line, there is a positive output gap. The economy is tight and the central bank will be on the lookout for inflation. There was a major negative output gap in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008, which caused fears of deflation. Once the central bankers have pored over all manner of inflation statistics, examined the output gap, and studied other data sources, they decide whether to cool the porridge, heat the porridge, or do nothing. Once the white line, the other main, if we type inflation break-even rates into the command line, the other main output and in the economy coincides with inflation, while slackness frequently use this output gap measurement to. The white line shows the potential or tightness and shows the actual. It is the difference between actual output and potential output. Once the central Once central bankers have made a decision, what tools do they have at their disposal? They can alter the money supply in many ways. One way that we saw in the currencies module is to print vast amounts of money. We will focus on two tools that they commonly use: adjusting short-term interest rates and making public statements about interest rate policy. Let's begin with short-term interest rates. Here we see the short-term interest rates for four of the most influential central banks: the Fed of the U.S., the Bank of England of the U.K., the ECB of Europe, and the Bank of Japan. Short-term interest rates are a powerful weapon that central banks have to combat, in particular, a positive output gap, which usually coincides with inflation. When short-term interest rates go up, it becomes more attractive to deposit cash. This dissuades consumption and investment. Therefore, rate hikes slow growth and contain inflation. By pulling up the FOMC function, we can see that the Federal Open Market Committee meets 8 times per year to set short-term interest rates. At any given point in the year, this screen will display the announced policy interest rate for meetings that have already happened. For those meetings in the future, the row will be blank. FOMC decisions are of tremendous interest to fixed-income investors because, as we'll see, they affect short-term government bond yields. If we bring up the main Bloomberg News headline feed by typing NH into the command line, we can clearly see how newsworthy FOMC decisions are, as evidenced by the torrent of headlines that accompany each of the 8 Fed decisions in any given year. This should not be surprising considering the Amazon example. Government bond yields are akin to Amazon's book prices. Accordingly, prices in the whole $101 trillion world bond market are influenced by the FOMC. By pulling up the FOMC function, we can see that the Federal Open Market Committee meets 8 times per year to set short-term interest rates. Let's see how the manipulation of short-term interest rates by a central bank has, in the past, set the economy back on the right track. Here is the output gap chart we looked at earlier. Let's overlay the Fed funds rate, the short-term interest rate controlled by the Fed. The output gap helps explain the Federal Reserve rate decisions. In the booming late 1980s, the economy was tight and rates went up. In the early 1990s recession, the economy had some slack and rates were cut sharply. In the dot-com boom starting in the late 90s, the economy tightened again and rates rose. In the dot-com bust in 2002, the economy developed some slack once more and rates were cut. In the real estate boom in the mid-2000s, the economy fired on all cylinders and rates were hiked steeply. Then Lehman happened and rates were cut to nearly zero. Subsequently, an unprecedented spell of near-zero interest rates helped reduce the sizable output gap. You now have some idea when and why the Fed changes short-term interest rates. As expectations underpin all market prices, another powerful tool that central bankers have at their disposal is simply to discuss their intentions about when they may move interest rates. Any statement that hints at a course of interest rates that is different from what the market is expecting will move bond yields. Investors will go so far as to put a new Fed statement next to the old one to look for minute changes. If we type FOMC side by side into the command line and select the STNI FOMC side by side function, we can pull up a comparison between successive FOMC statements with the precise differences highlighted. Knowing this, the Fed chair can drop hints to influence interest rates, as Ben Bernanke did in 2013. Let's pull up the U.S. 10-year bond yield by typing 10-year yield into the command line and selecting USGG10YR, generic 10-year U.S. government bond yields, a long-term time series of 10-year yields. Then, let's graph the yield from the start of 2012 to the end of 2014 and reset the y-axis so that it begins at 0. In May of 2013, Bernanke hinted that the Fed's purchase of bonds using central bank money might soon taper down, an action which would reduce the demand for treasuries and therefore the price of treasuries. Accordingly, the yield on 10-year U.S. government bonds almost doubled from 1.6% to 3% over the next 4 months. Given the power of short-term interest rates to influence the yields on all bonds, as we saw through the Amazon book price analogy, wouldn't it be nice to know what the market believes future FOMC decisions will be? As luck would have it, federal funds futures enable you to observe what the market expects the Federal Open Market Committee to do next. The futures and options market allows us to determine the probability of certain future FOMC decisions. Let's type interest rate probability into the command line and select the World Interest Rate Probability, or WIRP function. This shows a list of forthcoming FOMC meetings and the probability of a hike or cut at each meeting. The chart shows the evolution of predictions about FOMC decisions for a given meeting. At the time this screen was captured on February 2, 2017, Fed rates were set between 0.50 and 0.75%. The red line shows the percent chance of a rate cut at the next FOMC meeting on March 15. The futures and options market gave a 0% chance of a rate cut. The white line shows the percent chance of no rate change, in this case 68%. The blue line shows the percent chance of a rate hike, in this case 32%. Notice how the three numbers add up to 100%. Now let's look at WIRP on March 14, 2017, the day before the FOMC meeting. By this point, the market thought it was certain that the Fed would lift rates the next day. The market was correct on this occasion. The Federal Reserve did indeed lift rates on March 15, 2017. Think you've grasped these concepts? Answer these questions to check your understanding. To summarize, both inflation and deflation have a natural tendency to spiral out of control, and it is the job of central banks to stop that from happening. In the 1960s and 1970s, inflation was high around the world, which made bonds a terrible investment. Ever since then, bond investors have been keenly attuned to any signs of inflation. Central banks not only study inflation statistics but also measure the difference between actual and potential economic output to look for impending inflation or deflation problems. Central banks have two main tools to regulate money supply: interest rates and their influence over where consumers and businesses believe interest rates are headed. Short-term interest rates have proven to be somewhat effective over the past few decades to course-correct economies around the world.